Gen X, we're staring down some pretty alarming numbers when it comes to our retirement, our money, and our future. Here are 7 stats that should be a wake-up call for Gen X. And for each one of them, I've got 3 quick fixes that can turn things around if you find you're a part of that number. And stick with me, because the last stat about inherited homes, that one may surprise you. So let's get into it. The first stat is Social Security cuts, possibly 18%. Let's start with the 800-pound gorilla, Social Security. Now, I will mention in each of these stats that I list, I will mention the source information. I'll also link that source information in the description box below. And for this one, it's coming straight from the horse's mouth. The Social Security Administration Trustees Report. By 2033, Social Security is set to be cut 18% if Congress doesn't act. I'll be 66 years old in 2033, by the way. That's 1 year before full retirement age for Social Security benefits. For the average Gen Xer, that's like losing 1/5 of your paycheck. Imagine budgeting on what socialsecurity.gov tells you today that your estimated benefit's going to be. If it currently says that you're going to get $2,000 in monthly benefits, an 18% decrease would mean $360 less each month. Okay, we can't go to Congress and go tap on their shoulders about this, so what can we do? Number one is we have to save even more than we thought we were going to need. Whatever it takes to save more. Number two is pray that a fix comes, even if it's at the midnight hour, and that it includes some phased solution that spares Gen Xers. It's not that I wish this upon, the younger generations, but at least they have more time to buffer for it than we do. And number three, if the cuts do happen, the only other thing is to delay claiming your Social Security so that you can get that higher check going forward. And if you think this one is just a future problem, well, the next stat hits a little closer to home. Number two is 44% of Gen Xers are living paycheck to paycheck. So this comes from Bankrate. They posted their paycheck to paycheck survey, and it states that 4 in 10 Gen Xers are actually living paycheck to paycheck. That means nearly half of us have zero margin, for unplanned or surprise expenses. One car repair, one medical bill, and suddenly, whatever it is can't get fixed. Whatever it is can't get paid. And here's the hard truth. If your expenses already eat every single dollar, and you've responsibly cut out all the extras, then you can't budget your way out of this. Up until my 40s, I was living mostly paycheck to paycheck. Just when I would get just a little bit of breathing room, something would happen and it would clean me back out again. There was only one thing that broke that cycle for me. And I'll include it in these next 3 quick fixes to stop this crazy train in its tracks. Number one, you have to find a way to bring in more income. And not just some one-time bonus, although that does help. No, this needs to be some continuous flow of money coming in. Whether it's from a part-time job, a side gig, selling stuff online, renting out a room. This was the thing that finally broke it for me. And number two is don't increase your spending and your expenses just because you've got a little extra money coming in now. I put every single penny that I earned from that side gig and I invested it. So it wasn't real easy for me to get it back out and spend it. If you have to start working a part-time job, in addition, don't eat out more because you have less time now, to eat at home. Don't treat yourself more because you're working harder. Remember your why behind this sacrifice. And number 3, if you can't bring in more income right now, then find a way to drastically cut one big expense from your current situation. If you're living alone, then move back home. Yeah, remember I said drastic. It needs to be drastic. Take in a roommate or 2. If you have multiple cars with multiple car payments, then maybe, sell all of those and then take some of that out and replace it with a basic good car. Sell the boat, sell the 4-wheelers and the motorcycle. But if you think living paycheck to paycheck is stressful, wait till you hear how much debt Gen X is carrying. And number 3 is Gen X debt. It's $61,000 on average. Money.com has an article titled, "Which Generation Has the Most Debt?" And it's us. And when you break that debt down into categories, we're carrying the most in auto loans and credit card debt. Why are those 2 categories higher for us than any other generation? Are we driving more car than we need? Why so much credit card debt? We also owe, on average, $42,000 on student loan debt, still, and around $240,000 on mortgage debt. Those are ugly numbers. So the rapid fire task list for this one, it's going to resemble the previous points to-do list. Number 1, do everything we talked about in point number 2. Number 2 is debt is a cycle and it has to be broken. Just like the paycheck to paycheck cycle. Decide that you will attack it with a financial plan, but also a new mindset. Go look into every single debt account that you have and see how much interest you're paying every single month on that loan or credit card. Add up all of those interest charges, and that should be a wake-up call. And number 3 is lay out a strategy plan. List all those debts in a spreadsheet or in a notebook. Either way works fine. Next, work with an online debt repayment calculator. Bankrate.com has some good ones. Figure out how much you're going to commit to and for how long. And now let's talk about retirement savings. Number 4 is only 18% of Gen Xers have enough saved for retirement. Northwestern Mutual, they put out an extensive study, a very interesting one. It was called the 2025 Planning and Progress Study. In that report, only 18% of Gen Xers had 8 times their income saved for retirement. And according to Fidelity, by age 50, they recommend that we have 6 times our income saved. And by 60, it should be 8 times. What the report did show is that nearly half of Gen X only had 2 times or less of their income saved. So we know Social Security isn't looking great. We also know that most of us didn't get pensions. We know as well that the cost of living is crushing the middle class. So what are we supposed to do? Just throw up our hands in the air? We're going to have to fight this one, Gen X. And whether you muster up your inner Braveheart or King Leonidas or the battle cry of Xena, all of them, they faced major odds. And they all kind of lost in the end. But not without a fight. So how do we do that? Number 1 is get fit and stay healthy for as long as possible, because we're more than likely going to have to work longer and or work part-time in our retirement. 48% of Gen X say they are planning to do this, but you've got to be well enough in order to endure it. So that's number one. Number two is, again, do everything in point number one to save even more. Save like you've never saved before. And number three is invest, invest, invest. You don't have to put it all in the market, but growth is absolutely necessary for us. And for any that you do have sitting in a savings account, at least make sure it's a high-yielding savings account. Most of those are online, not your local brick-and-mortar one. And while we're fighting the battle to build up our nest egg, don't let your guard down and let the enemy outflank you, like in the next point. Number 5 is 32% of Gen X get hit by scams and fraud. IPX put out a report called the 2024 American Fraud and Identity Theft Statistics. In it, it shows that 1 in 3 Gen Xers has been targeted by scams and fraud. And the average amount lost by all age groups is $2,600. Identity theft has affected 26% of Gen Xers, the highest of any other generation. And scammers, they're only getting better, with their fake texts, phone calls, websites that look identical. So this is a threat that's not going away anytime soon. We have to put on armor that protects us without us having to think about it all the time. And here are 3 quick fixes. Number 1, freeze your credit with all 3 credit bureaus. There's TransUnion.com, Equifax.com, Experian.com. It doesn't take that long, but you've got to do it with all 3 of them. And that prevents anyone from opening any credit in your name. Number 2 is make a point of regularly checking your bank accounts, your brokerage accounts, your credit card statements. What do I mean by regularly? Once a day, once a week. We're currently living in the wild, wild west when it comes to this stuff. So I don't think checking it every day is too much. Do you? Especially since it's so convenient today. You have the app on your phone or your tablet. And number 3 is make sure every single account that you have has 2-factor authentication set up on it. That's the least you can do today, but it's not automatically set up in most cases. And it's not foolproof, but it's just an extra layer in your armor. And number 4, this is a bonus one. Just trust no links whatsoever, not in emails, not in texts. I'll even notch it up a little further. Don't trust any emails or texts, period, unless they're from family or friends. I know many businesses, they want to start interacting, with their customers through text now. If you want to maybe set up an appointment with me through text, that's fine. But anything beyond that, I'm balking. I don't want to pay my invoice through a text. None of that. Scams, they're painful. But this next stat, it shocked me. Okay, number 6 is Medicare premiums rising 188%. What? Okay, Newsweek recently reported this. From the 2026 Medicare update on premiums and benefits. We talk a lot about Social Security and its woes, but Medicare is obviously facing big troubles as well. Medicare Part B premiums are projected to increase to around $350 per month by 2034. That's a 188% increase. And that's just the base premiums. Higher earners, they'll pay even more with surcharges. So if you're planning your retirement, don't assume Medicare is going to be a bargain like I have. And since Medicare premiums, they're deducted from your Social Security check once you start claiming that, that's going to make your Social Security check feel even smaller. And this cost, it's automatic when you turn 65. Unless you're still working and getting your health care through your employer. But no, at 65, this cost, it's mandatory, whether you're healthy or not. So is there any way to be proactive in a solution to this? It's another one of those where we're dependent upon the politicians and the lawmakers, to tackle. And while we wait on them, there are a few things that we can work on. Number one is find out if you're eligible for a health savings account, an HSA. If you have a high deductible health insurance plan, you may be eligible. I won't go into here all of the eligibility, requirements. There's plenty of that online. But I will say that getting access to one through your job isn't the only option. You may be able to set one up yourself, at a brokerage firm. Put the maximum amount in every year because it's not that high. So put the max in, invest it, leave it alone, don't touch it if you can, let it grow. You'll save taxes today with your contributions, and it'll be tax-free when you retire because you can use that money to pay or help pay those Medicare premiums. And number two is manage your modified adjusted gross income. Read up and research on what can trigger, a Medicare premium surcharge or an IRMA charge, as it's technically known. If you make above a certain threshold, Medicare will charge you extra for your Medicare premiums. And they have a 2-year look-back period for that. If you took out a big lump sum from your 401k, that will definitely show up as income. So either talk to a financial advisor or research strategies to try and avoid those premium surcharges if you can. And number three, and since these Medicare premiums are automatically deducted from your Social Security check, two of the tasks that I covered in point one will work here. Save more and pray more that a solution will come. And finally, let's talk about the family home dream because it's not that simple. And number 7 is 42% of younger heirs can't afford to keep the homes they inherit. LegalZoom shared this data, on a report that was updated in August 2025, that 42% of those that will inherit homes, they feel they won't be able to afford to keep those homes. They cited that the reasons were costs related to property taxes, insurance, the ongoing maintenance costs, or the existing debt that's still attached to the property. Now, this report was done on the younger generations, 18 to 44, which is clearly not Gen X. But I feel it's a very, very telling stat. And if they know they'll have a problem keeping it, then it's more than likely a problem across the board. As a Gen Xer, maybe you've inherited property already. Have you experienced, these cost issues and struggles? Do you think that this could be a future problem, if and when you leave your home to your kids? It's something to think about because 42% is a high number and it could go much higher. So if we're set to inherit a home, sometime in the future, what can we do, to keep that home if selling it outright is a last resort? Number one, you can choose to either rent it out long-term or short-term. Number 2, if there are multiple heirs, it could be set up with co-ownership, but this needs to be done legally and with a real estate attorney. And number 3 is check with your local governments to see if you're eligible to apply for property tax relief, through tax abatements or freezes. Some, the only requirement is being a senior or, having low income. The dream of passing down property is a powerful one, but it should never trap the next generation. So there's a reason why I wanted to do this video today. It's not just because I wanted to spout out, all the bad news that's circulating. No, I truly believe that knowledge is power. When it comes to these 7 stats, we don't need to be caught off guard because many of them, Gen X is on the front lines currently. But I don't want us to be obsessed about thinking about them either. Let's just be prepared in different ways, whether it's financially, emotionally, intellectually. Let's start thinking like a warrior and how we can protect ourselves and put your 3-part action plans in force today. Don't wait. And if you want more steps on how to help Gen X navigate money, lifestyle, and retirement, then please subscribe. And check out my next video right here, Retirement Traps that will cost you thousands, but not if you know about them in advance. So you want to watch that. I'll link it right here. Until next time, take care of yourself and your future. Bye.